So I would like to say welcome to our session. I put my hands up to all of you who are joining us today. Aiswael, Amit Kutwila Makwat, Talitzel Kwa Lakamel, Talitzel Kwa Tsayalis, Dara Kelly Tilsquich, Quiquihas Tilsquich. My name is Dr. Dara Kelly, and I'm an assistant professor at the Beedie School of Business. And I teach in the area of business and society. And it's my pleasure to act today as our moderator for our session. This is our third of our virtual SFU Ideas at Beedie series, researching in Indigenous business environments. This year marks the 40th anniversary of the official formation of the business school at Simon Fraser University. And as part of our celebrations, we have launched Ideas at SFU Beedie, a webinar series that showcases the thought leadership of our faculty and networks at Beedie as we share our insights into some of the most important issues of our time. So generally at Beedie, we live and work in the traditional, ancestral, and unceded homelands of the Coast Salish peoples, including our relatives at Tsleil-Waututh, Coquitlam, Squamish, Humathquim, and as a Stalo Coast Salish faculty member, I'm fortunate to be able to nurture kin relationships professionally through my teaching and research. And this forum is a perfect opportunity to continue the traditions of relational work through dialogue, sharing of ideas, and affirming the resilience of intergenerational knowledge. So we deliberately organized this particular session in the month of June, recognizing that here in Canada, in 1 week, on the 21st of June, is Indigenous Peoples Day. And it's also an auspicious time as the longest day of the year, the summer solstice. Many events take place throughout this month. In many cases, we're honoring the legacy of colonization, which we're contending with, and in particular, honoring the resilience of our ancestors whose strength we credit moving through and coming out of the darkness of that time. This time last year was a particularly challenging time as the world learned of our residential school history, affirming what our Indigenous relations have known for generations already, that education for Indigenous peoples caused great harm, and our grief is still familiar. On the other side of the world, our whānau, or Indigenous family, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, are celebrating the shortest day of the year, or Matariki, the Maori New Year. So you can see in this slide, Matariki is represented through the constellation of Pleiades. So I reflect on the teachings of one of my Maori mentors, Manuka Henare, who shared that for all Maori, the New Year is a time to celebrate seasonal fertility and those who have passed. It recognizes transition from old to new, preparation for new life, and reminds us of the potential for a good life. It is then fitting that our agenda today focuses on research and Indigenous business environments with our esteemed panel of Indigenous researchers. We are thrilled to welcome also attendees from locally from BC, across Canada, and internationally. We have a wide audience attending today. On our panel, we have 4 Indigenous business scholars. 2 are currently based out of the Gustafson School of Business at the University of Victoria, and 2 are Māori scholars at business schools in Aotearoa, New Zealand, here to discuss the research in Indigenous business environments. So we will begin with insights from our panelists. And for the final section of our seminar today, we're going to move into breakout rooms for some conversations amongst yourselves to discuss some provocative questions around the potentiality of Indigenous futures. So we also encourage you to put your questions into Zoom in the comment box at any time through the session, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those questions as we can. So businesses and business schools are under increasing pressure to be more reflective of Indigenous communities, Indigenous knowledge, and Indigenous businesses and economies where they operate, and to ensure they contribute positively to them. It's my pleasure to introduce 4 of our colleagues that are undertaking this research. We have Dr. Shelley Price, is a newly appointed assistant professor at the Gustafson School of Business. She has joined the school in January, I believe, and Shelley is an Inuk woman born in the Nunavut region of Labrador. Shelley's work calls for trauma-informed and culturally humble approaches to leadership, with keen interest on the intersecting injustices between race, gender, mental health, and the environment. And she works with Indigenous storytelling, collective, affective, and land-based wisdom. Dr. Nimba Stanland is of Ngatiawa Ngaituhui descent and joined the management department as a lecturer at the Auckland University of Technology in 2017. She teaches management, HR, and diversity. And Nimbus completed her doctoral research doing a national study of the business school in the New Zealand tertiary sector, interviewing Māori academics, Māori commentators, and key decision makers to examine career experiences and aspirations for Māori in the academy. Dr. Jason Mika is a descendant of Ngaituhui, Whakatohia, Ngatiawa, Ngati Kahungunu tribes of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Dr. Mika is an associate professor, I believe also a reasonably new position at the Waikato University, Te Raupapa Waikato Management School. And Dr. Mika's research includes aspects of Indigenous entrepreneurship, management, and methodologies. We also have Dr. Frank Bastien as an assistant professor at the Gustafson School of Business. He is a Huron-Wendat from the Indigenous community of Wendake and has observed incongruities between Indigenous ways of organizing and contemporary colonial models. He aims to translate Indigenous knowledge and challenge colonial assumptions, and also sits on the editorial board of the Academy of Management Learning and Education, one of our journals in the field. So I'm going to ask our panelists 2 questions, and so I'd like to hear from each of you on each of these 2 questions. The first question is, what brought you into academia and what drives your research interests? Sorry, there's 2 questions. So I'd like to start with Jason.
Kia ora Dara, kia ora tātou, ka nui te mihi kia tātou I tēnei rā. Greetings everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to join you all today and to be here. I'm coming to you from the Waikato in Hamilton, New Zealand. And for me, as Dara outlined, I was born in Whakatanes, and my whānau mainly from the Bay of Plenty region, Mātātua Waka, same as Nimbus, Ngāti Awa Tūhoi, but also Whakatohia as well. And so for me, I guess, so I've just recently joined Te Raupapa, which is the Waikato Management School in Hamilton. And I actually studied there about years ago now. Just want to congratulate you on the celebration of your 40 years of your business school. At Te Raupapa, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of our business school, Te Raupapa, at Waikato University. And I just realized I'm a year older than our business school. So I'm what you call in Aotearoa, kaumātua, old fella. So it's really good to be amongst you younger ones, to be here today. So the question, Dara, was what brought me into academia? Is that right?
Yeah, what brought you into academia, and sort of what's your driver for your research? What's your passion?
Well, before I got into going back to university and studying for my doctorate, which was in Māori entrepreneurship, I was a management consultant for 10 years and working with Māori and Indigenous companies. And being a consultant, what happens? Well, you've got to chase the work, you've got to do the work, you've got to pay the bills. It gets it's lovely work, but you need a bit of a change. And so university, going back to university sort of appealed to me. And basically, when I got to Massey University in the School of Management there, I was asked to teach, and I'd never taught before. And my supervisor said, "You'd be great at it. You'd be good at it," And I says, "Oh, I'll give it a go." And they says, I says, "Well, how big is the class?" They said 600 students, and I said, "What? You're crazy. I can't teach that." So I spent the first 6 weeks sort of, freaking out, standing in front of all these sort of 18-year-old kids, trying to sort of teach them first-year management. But I realized I loved it. I really enjoyed teaching. And as I got into the research on Māori business, Māori entrepreneurship, I realized I loved that too. So I realized then university is the place that I want to be, and researching, writing and teaching Māori business, Indigenous business is what I wanted to do. So I've been really blessed to be able to do that. And for me, it's the best job because what it does for me is that it allows me to bring all of that sort of experience of management consulting and working with Māori enterprise and all of their wonderful aspirations and challenges with a sort of research. And for me, the research, the industry connections, and all of the stuff that Māori and Indigenous business are doing feeds into the research, and the research feeds into what they're doing. And everything that I research and everything that I do in terms of the advisory work, the consultancy type work, goes into the lessons. So whatever I'm learning through research and through advice, my students get that as well through teaching Māori and Indigenous business at the university. So it's kind of just this big sort of synthesis that's going on, I guess, is how I would describe it. And what really drives me is really a desire to rewrite our management textbooks. If you've ever done a first-year management course at university, we're still learning about Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, and a fellow called Taylor, and a whole bunch of other wonderful management sort of experts of their time. But we're Indigenous management experts, and their knowledge and their ways and their ideas. So I really want us to challenge all of us really to sort of rewrite those management textbooks with Indigenous business philosophies, practices, knowledges, case studies, and all of that. And to be able to teach that in our university systems is really, I guess, what I want to do next. So kia ora, that's enough for me.
Thank you very much, Jason. I'd like to turn to Shelley and hear some of your insights about what brought you into academia.
Atsili hai, Shelley Obunga, Labradori mute, Mimagi mute. Nakumik, thank you for having me here. Wishing you love and light. Nalinat ama ikumak. This is a really big passion for me, is sharing love and sharing light. And so what brings me here to academia? Sharing the love, sharing the light, finding ways to, I guess, bring about deep understandings of what it means to live a life of deep passion, in connectedness with family, in connectedness to lands, in deep reflection of who I am or who we are as peoples. And that's really what drives me and brings me into the academy. Just to start a little bit backwards, I worked in an educational institution in administration for a lot of years. My first degree was in accounting. And I did a lot of crunching numbers and noticing where money was going and where money wasn't going. Money wasn't going to the health and well-being of the employees. And in many ways, there were a number of conflicts that were happening inside of the working space, and the institution as a whole was also not, as I could see it, engaging responsibly with society and challenging the status quo of what was being taught. And so for me, it became I have to leave this money area and follow what I see is wrong. And so I did a degree in human resources, but primarily in safety and health. And then I decided my great grandmother and the words that she wrote in her memoirs were really important. They had driven me my entire life to get an education and stand up for the lands, stand up for the lands and stand against anything that was trying to take or tear down what Labrador is and what the lands are. And so working in academia gives me that opportunity to work in collaboration with communities that are engaging in the disruptions of extractive industry and oppression of peoples. And so I get to work every day with people who are making these efforts to reshape the world that we live in, to value the hearts and minds and bodies and spirits, the souls of who we are as peoples and lands. And so for me, it's all about following my passion, finding that light and being guided by love.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you, Shelley. So I'd like to turn to Frank.
Oh, Dara, I knew you'd do this. You always make me go after Shelley. Shelley is so expressive and she says wonderful things and she really paints a picture with her stories. And Jason, a lot of passion with you as well. And I knew you'd do this to me, but that's okay. First of all, I'm really happy to be here. Dara, big thanks to you and Christine for organizing this event. Quick way, everybody. My name is François Bastien. I'm from Wendake. I'm a Huron-Wendat, far away from my community here on the West Coast. Same thing for Shelley, but the point of embedding your research also in your home community means that you get to go back home a little bit. So that's been my technique, certainly. And flying across the continent. To get to your question there, what an amazing question. And to be honest with you, I don't know what the hell I'm doing in academia. I ask myself this every day. And there's certainly a couple of things I can talk about here, and I think that the first thing to say is it's pretty simple, right? I enjoyed writing and reading, and I enjoyed listening to stories and telling stories. So based on that, I thought the classroom was an excellent platform to tell stories, and research provided me with an audience to write stories. So I saw academia as a really important platform to generate stories in different forms. When I got there, of course, I was exposed to the structure of academia, which is about finding a gap in existing literature and filling that gap. And I noticed that there was very little room for Indigenous knowledges because, of course, Indigenous knowledges, we're not building on something. So meaning we're not building on Western knowledge. We're building on the many knowledges that different Indigenous communities and nations have around the world. So then I noticed that, what was happening is we were getting pushed to the periphery a little bit, special issues, away from the core. It's almost like, there's this control over the core, and then anything else that has to do with other ways of seeing the world, not just Indigenous, other ways of seeing the world. Well, let's push them out on the side, on the periphery. Let's give them a little bit of importance. But as Jason mentioned, we're still talking about the same dead people that existed many, 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 many years ago. Not to say that there hasn't been any contribution, certainly, but we're still embedded in this reality. Is what I call a little bit of cognitive imperialism, one way of seeing the world, a particular perspective on what progress is all about, what the future holds and how to get there. And I just found that there was a lot of room here to kind of break these structures, these institutional pillars. Of course, it takes time to do, but then, of course, the opportunity, especially recently, arose in Canada, of course, with reconciliation. With other popular political moves to give a voice to Indigenous peoples, although those are publicly and politically supported. What I've noticed is in our institutions, especially in business schools, because that's my experience, and let's not forget there's absolutely nothing in the world more Western than a business school, right? So of course the fit with Indigenous knowledge becomes extremely difficult here, especially considering that at the core of the curriculum, business schools, is how to exploit resources for economic purposes, oftentimes natural resources, much different than any Indigenous worldviews. We can talk about other components, such as the lone hero entrepreneur, very incommensurable with certainly the way the Huron-Wendat view the world, and we were known for entrepreneurship, or certainly a form of entrepreneurship. I don't know if I would call it entrepreneurship, but all these things, created a platform where business schools started and organizational studies start to become interested in Indigenous knowledges. A little bit of room to maneuver here. And I think it's about time we've pushed the planetary boundaries, the definition of progress in terms of where we are today. Well, we are on a precipice right now, so are we going to see 3-4 more generations? So here we are with a new dynamic that instead of sort of using business schools and business thinking and capitalism to try to fix Indigenous communities, well, we are in a new dynamic where maybe we should start listening to Indigenous wisdom from different parts of the world to see how we can inform Western thinking instead of the other way around. Certainly here in Canada, it's a little bit ironic because it seems that and I say this a lot, that Christianity has been replaced by capitalism. The Bible has been replaced by marketing textbooks, and missionaries have been replaced by business educators. In other words, if we can make Indigenous peoples consumers and entrepreneurs, well, if they participate in the economy, then they're part of society. Before they do that, they're not. So there were a lot of dynamics here that really interested me, and I find that there's more and more room to wiggle here. And look at this panel. There's a bunch of people that are interested in this, but also Indigenous scholars in business school doing really good work in terms of transforming things, whether in the classroom, whether on university campuses, whether in textbooks, but it's on. The work is on, and it's progressing. And so I thought, well, let's jump onto this bandwagon and let's try to do something collectively, especially when people are starting to talk together across continents. We're developing a critical mass here. And I think we're getting more and more of a voice. And so wanted to tell stories, liked reading and writing. And here we are with a good opportunity for Indigenous scholars to collaborate and to really rethink the role of business in society, to rethink the role of organizing and organizations in society. I think we are there. And I think that business schools and Westerners could learn a lot if they take a moment and listen. And this work is difficult to do. And I'll finish with this, Dara. This work is difficult to do because you got to dig under layers and layers of colonization. Knowledges are deep. They still exist, but they've colonization has worked to eliminate them. So there is a lot. It requires a lot of time to translate this knowledge. One of the things, and I said I was finished with this, but one of the things that I love about my job now is the fact that it's taking me to Indigenous communities, and I get to meet different Indigenous peoples from other nations. For me, this is the best part of my job, meaning the data collection, the conversations, listening to stories. This is what drives my work, because as we all know, Maoris are not Wendats. Wendats are not Coast Salish. Inuits are not Mohawks, and so on and so forth. There is this complexity there, and I think that this complexity is really rich in knowledge, and I think the entire world can learn from it. So I guess here I am. Still, I don't know why I'm in a business school, but I'm here on this panel, Dara. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Frank. We're going to come back to some of these threads of conversation, but I'd like to invite Nimbus to share your perspective. What brought you into academia?
Okay, well, kia ora tātou. I te taho toku karaua, ko pitawa ki te maunga, ko rangi tai ki te awa, ko mā tātua te waka, ko tūtau te marae, ko ngā mahi te hapu, ko ngā te awa te iwi. Mai te taho toku kuia, ko maunga pōhatu te maunga, ko tauranga te awa, ko Ngāti Raka me tamarua rangi ngā hapu, ko tā taia hape me rārua ngā marae, ko ngai tūhoi te iwi, ko Nimbus Stanlin, so ko ingoa nā reira tēnā tātou katoa. So kia ora everybody, thank you for having me on, and thank you to the organisers and to Dara for the invitation. What I just shared with you there is what we call a pepeha, which is our kind of introduction, our connection to our lands through our genealogy, I guess. And as Jason mentioned earlier, we're both from the same tribe, Tūhui, and he grew up in Whakatane, which is in the Eastern Bay of Plenty. That's where my grandparents are from. So I gave you kind of two lineages. One is from my grandfather's side, and one is from my grandmother's side. And that's through my maternal lineage. So I didn't actually grow up in Whakatane. I grew up in Auckland City, which is very city slicker. It's kind of, how I'd be teased as a kid from my cousins who were actually growing up in Whakatane and the areas around there. And I share that with you because that's, that is my experience. I grew up with my father, who is non-Indigenous, and my mum, who is Indigenous, but very much in what we call Pākehā, non-Indigenous whānau environment. And my grandparents were like my only link, I guess, to my culture in terms of hearing the reo, the language, the native language. But it was something that they would do to hide stuff from us. It's like it was coded language for the kids, so they would kind of talk between themselves as opposed to sharing it with us and teaching us. So in terms of like what got me into academia, I was very much just on kind of a typical journey, I guess, post high school. Did a little bit of an OE, which is kind of celebrated here in New Zealand, to go overseas and do a bit of an exchange. And I came back and I got to work, and it wasn't until I actually had my daughter in 2008 that I realized I hated my job. I had this, flash vision of the future that looked pretty miserable and just very miserable. I decided I needed to finally go to university, get an education, and assumed that would give me some kind of opportunities for me and for her. And I remember being in high school, there was, I don't know if it was a teacher who said this to me, but I remember someone saying, like, education's like this ladder, and wherever you stop on the ladder is where your children start. And so I don't think that ever drove me, because I clearly didn't go to university straight out of school, but it was something that has sat with me. And so I kind of thought, if I do this, this is going to open up opportunities for us. So I never thought I'd be an academic. I never thought I would go to university. But I ended up, and I'm not even that interested in business still, I think. I just went for these kind of better opportunities. And once I was in the university, I think I was a little bit interested, and I still am, in what people do really, what people are doing with their lives and why people do the things that they do. So I did an undergraduate in psychology and in business and HR. And it was basically because of interest from a lecturer that I was working with in business, who kind of supported me and sponsored me. She was non-Indigenous. I don't think we had any Indigenous academics in the business school at that time. And she basically encouraged me and connected me to scholarships for postgraduate study and those kind of opportunities, which meant like you're just kind of taking one step at a time through this postgraduate journey, suddenly realizing, okay, maybe there's an actual position in this for me afterwards. And she basically encouraged me into the PhD. And for the PhD, I, as Dara mentioned, did a national study with Māori business academics. So that was kind of motivated by this idea that people kept being really interested in the fact that I was Māori and in this university, and I was doing so well. And I was really confused by it all, to be honest. I hadn't really engaged with Indigenous knowledge in an academic space before. It seemed really like it just hadn't happened in my educational journey. So that PhD was kind of the first time that I was able to kind of bring these two worlds together. And I thought it was fascinating. I thought it was fascinating, probably frightening as well, because I felt like there was this understanding that I was a novice. I was a novice as a PhD student, but I was a novice in terms of this, Indigenous worldview, Indigenous knowledge. I had, some things that had been kind of passed down from my grandparents, but I was definitely still learning, as we all are, I guess. And so that was, I guess, the PhD journey. And the cool part about it was that I was interviewing and conversing with people who were living this reality every day. These are Māori in the university who have been there for some time, kind of sharing their challenges and their aspirations with me. So that was a really, really cool experience, a really good learning experience. And I guess that kind of, those conversations and those kōrero really empowered me to take up the mantle, I would say, of going into the academic career, because it did seem like a bit of a challenge. It did seem like it was not going to be easy. That was something I heard, from my participants as well, that it wouldn't be easy, particularly in the business space. As Frank mentioned, those kind of opposing worldviews are operating kind of consistently in the space. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of say how I got into academia. And so in terms of my research interests, I've basically just been drawing connections between, who I am and the things that I'm interested in. So that led me to this, bringing in the Indigenous interest and interest in work and what people do, which is, one of the definitions I have of career is just what people do, very broad. And so that's my research interest, I guess, is Indigenous experiences of work and career. So I guess one thing I just want to highlight from that is, when we're talking about the lack of representation of Indigenous academics in the universities, I think what my story illustrates, at least, is that it's really important to have some mentors, some sponsors in the university who are going to support you and, support our students to come through, but also the practicality of having those actual money, resources, jobs, that they're not overworked in, obviously. But all of that is really important if we're serious about actually increasing that representation. Hope that answers your question.
Nice. Thank you, Nimbus. I think that's something I think about frequently, is this idea of actually how new this is within this particular discipline, bringing Indigenous knowledges and actually elevating and highlighting the ways, Indigenous ways of thinking and being and doing within our discipline is not a very old tradition. If we look at the literature and we see who is publishing into this space, it's really not that long that we've all been doing this work. So I also want to honor and recognize some of our guests, and we will invite some of these contributions, but I can see we have some of these researchers within our guests today with Diane Rufio and also Joe Gladstone within the Academy of Management too. So I'd like to get to our second question before we go into some discussion and breakout rooms. So Jason, your experience crosses over two institutions, Massey University and Waikato, and also your area is Indigenous entrepreneurship. So I wanted to ask you a question about what are some of the tensions that arise with regards to balancing what you want to do, your passion in research and everything. And also we have this pull of what institutions need or want from us as Indigenous scholars. Sometimes they're not the same thing. Yeah, do you have anything on that?
Kia ora Dara, kia ora tātou. Just want to acknowledge the kōrero from Nimbus, Frank and Shelley. It's just amazing. So for me, when I got into the research and being part of the university system, you realize quickly that you're part of an institution that's been around a while and it's got a fixed purpose, a fixed view of its function, and it's there to serve, serve government, serve business, serve community, and it has a view of what that is. And I think constantly what, for me, are sort of saying, well, I've got a different view, I've got a different view about what I want to do and who I want to serve. And it's our, it's our Māori community, our Māori business community in particular. So what drives me is what are their interests, what are their needs, what are their problems, what are their questions that they want answers to. And that really guides my research. And like Frank, I just love listening to stories. So the more people I can interview and talk to, the better. So, so that's also something that drives me too. But I think really some of the tension comes down to university. What does it want? It wants us to, as academics, to publish, to write, to teach, to research, to secure external research funding, to pay the bills, to keep the lights on. And it requires us to engage with communities, with the business community, with the rest of the community. It requires us to be, good academic citizens. And what that means is basically you better be able to do everything and do it well. And so for me, when I got into doing the research, basically what happens when you like doing research, you like doing writing, and you like doing teaching is that everything looks good. And so whenever anyone asks you to do something, you say, yeah, okay, I'll do that. And someone says, I've got this research idea, you want to join it? And I say, yeah, I'll join on that. Next minute, you're doing 30 research projects and your boss is saying, well, hang on, that's, what's going on there? That's just too much and it's a bit crazy, and it was. But basically that describes the sort of last 5 years of my life, 30 research projects, teaching and trying to publish at the same time. Now, what the academic progression ladder says, you want to be a professor, publish. A-star journals better, but even that's not good enough. It has to be FT50. So if it's in the FT50 list of journals, then yes, that counts even more. Textbooks, no, not so much. Book chapters, no, not so much. Talking to people, well, only if you have to, So, but please write these journal articles and everything will be rosy. Everything will be good, So that's the tension. And the problem is when our people knock on the door, our whānau from Waimana, from Rātuki, they stop at the office and they knock on your door and say, Jason, we've got a problem. We've got an economic challenge here. We need to recreate a sort of a micro sort of economy for our Tūhoe people on Mauna Pohatu, a place that, it's pretty tough to sort of create an economy. And so what do? People are asking for help. And so the institution is saying, no, stay home and publish and write. And so sort of that kind of tension is between what our people need and want and their questions and their problems and their challenges and their aspirations. Research to support that versus, I guess, what the institution is looking for is, whatever you do, just publish. So there's always that constant tension between the institution and what you want. Now, the other thing that strikes me is the reality is, as Frank's outlined, these institutions are becoming interested in Indigenous world views, Indigenous business. What is that? How do we incorporate that into what we do? And in Aotearoa, we have Te Tiriti o Waitangi, or the Treaty of Waitangi, which is the relationship agreement between Māori and the Crown, which says what we're going to do for one another and support one another. Now, the problem is that universities as institutions, and I'll just quickly make this point, is they do want to recognise and honour the commitments under Te Tiriti o Waitangi. They do. But they're still trying to figure out what that actually means. And what it means, what I've worked out in my mind, the conclusion I've come to is what it means is power sharing. And when basically that's what it comes down to. And now, what does power sharing actually look like and mean in an institution like a university or any organization that chooses to honour and recognise Te Tiriti o Waitangi as a partnership between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people? What does it mean in practical terms? So when the university's business school dean says, we want to honour the treaty, what does that actually mean? And who decides what that looks like? Ultimately, for example, if the Māori or Indigenous business academics say, well, actually, we need an Indigenous business program, or we need Indigenous business content as part of our management courses that we're teaching in our degrees. Who decides what happens with that? Well, it's not the Indigenous community. There's no sort of sense of partnership or power sharing in the decisions that get made around that proposal. So when you say, yes, we want to honour the treaty, but we'll decide what that looks like. That's one of the big challenges that our institutions have to grapple with. Now, are there examples of different ways of going about it? Yes, there are. If we choose to look, and if our institutions are willing to sort of adapt the way that they do things to provide for power sharing arrangements and what that looks like. So I'll leave it there. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Jason. So Shelley, I know that's I mentioned in your bio that you focus on trauma-informed teaching within your pedagogical practice. So I'm interested about that decision to do that, and I'd like to hear from you about what that looks like.
Thank you for giving me the space to talk about this. Certainly for me, I think that trauma-informed as well as culturally humble practices have been challenged, critiqued, examined in various different ways that, in essence, attempts to victimize people or persons, especially Indigenous peoples within spaces and education, but also all quote unquote marginalized peoples. And so when I'm looking at trauma-informed pedagogy or trauma or culturally humble ways of engaging in creating safe spaces in the classroom, I'm trying to look at them in intersectional ways. But for me, what that means is bringing in and and valuing the wholeness of all people who walk into place and space. So heart, mind, body, spirit, all present, and their connectedness to their dreams or aspirations, to gain an education, but also the presence of their family in that space, the presence of all of the other influences that are shaping whether or not they can be present in that space. And the wholeness recognizes that they are anger, they are sadness, they are grief, they are hopes, they are dreams. And that all of those things from past, present, and future are there inside of the classroom. But also recognizing that wholeness as we're much more complex beings than what often business schools will allow us to be. And often, and I'm going to say this and recognizing that this is not the truth, but that, we're not soulless, heartless extractors and exploiters. Not all of us. Anyway, please, I hope. When good people enter, quote unquote, bad systems, sometimes they turn into what we could never have imagined them being. And so I'm imagining right now kind of the conversion into wolf, a werewolf, whatever it may be, but there's that becoming, and recognizing that we're all capable of all of these things. Now that's just kind of let's just toss that in the background. But really, in essence, what I'm trying to do is nurture that awareness about race, about gender, about mental health, about connectedness beyond, the knowledge that's living in the textbook, but connectedness beyond that to environment, to family, etc. And the presence that we're living in today with climate anxiety, eco grief, is making it really tough to keep our focus and our attention with race-based relations, with traumas that are happening inside of our families, inside of our communities, and the exploitations that are happening all around us that we're privy to. So I guess for me, is bringing in that love and light, is creating a pedagogical space where they can honor who they are. If they're sad that day, they're sad that day, and I will love them no matter what. If they're silent that day, or if they can't come in that day, that doesn't give me the right to not teach them. I'm still there, present for them in some way, shape, or form, creating and nurturing these places and spaces where they're allowed to be, they're allowed to exist, where their values matter to me. So I'm trying to lead towards what I would call sustainable, just, equitable, diverse, inclusive, healthy, and safe ways of organizing the classroom, and to nurture belongingness and well-being. And doing that in ways that the students are equal participators in the shaping of the knowledge that is generated and organized in that space. Their stories matter to me. I get to go into classrooms and hear the stories of students every single day. I'm telling you, I'm full of goosebumps every time I enter into a classroom, because I know that these students are going to be able to share some of their lived experiences. And they do. They find the way, the courage to bring about what they've lived through and what they believe in into these spaces. So I guess in a lot of ways, pedagogically, what I'm trying to nurture is a place or space where every voice matters, every heart matters, and that everything that they care about is allowed to be in that space. And no matter what they feel in that moment in time, if they're angry with me or sad or they disagree with me, I value that, because that is their lived experience. So I guess in summary, with love and light, I try to bring love and light into the classroom, honoring their hearts, minds, bodies, and spirits, honoring their voice, and giving them place and space so that they can co-learn and co-create the learning environment. I do try to bring in awareness, again, about race-based dynamics. The world that we're living in is much more transparent. We see the hurt and the hardship, and the only way to face that is with connection and resistance. Standing up against these things, but doing that together in solidarity.
Thank you for sharing, Shelley. That's incredible work, and I know that balancing that plus the work of delivering content, plus managing energies, plus paying attention to learning outcomes is all such a, it's a lot of labor that is actually unfolding in that environment as well. So Frank, I know that I wanted to ask you about some of the connections that you're finding or not finding with regards to institutional memory. So you have been researching institutional memory from a theoretical perspective, and I know you're taking a lot of that into the way that you look at working within universities. So how do you? Yeah, I think it's about the potential there of what institutional memory holds in business schools.
Yeah, what a great question, Dara, and a loaded one, because of course I do a lot of work with collective memory in communities, especially when looking at residential schools now. A couple of projects looking at trauma and materiality in terms of the buildings that have been left over in different communities and outside communities. So talking about residential schools and the meaning and how communities make sense of these physical entities and how it helps them remember or helps them forget. But more specifically, I think your question is more in terms of institutions and things that are difficult to change in business schools and in academia. One of the and we've discussed this before. When I was first asked to speak, and there are important institutional barriers for researchers that are on this panel right now. Doing work in communities means taking time, building relationships, tweaking research questions so they can help communities and not just advance Western knowledge in our journals. Certainly that work is time consuming, not very in line, these long-term approaches, with more of the short-term expectations of academia, especially in terms of getting tenure, because of course long-term approaches, the idea here is to rebuild these systems, to try to understand them better, and that is quite time consuming. And as I said before, there's nothing more Western than a business school. So to build on existing knowledge becomes extremely difficult, because traditionally, Indigenous communities were seen as empirical sites. Oh, look, this is something different, so maybe it could advance some part of an established theory. But of course, moving away from that, so the work that we need to do is say, well, we're looking at things differently. So we're exploring a phenomenon that cannot be used to build on something that already exists, especially in our literature. and when I go up for tenure, there's going to be a bunch of global scholars that are going to evaluate my work. There's no knowledge holders or knowledge keepers from Indigenous communities saying, wow, this is valid work. Our audience is, although we're trying to do the best we can to satisfy our communities and their quest to express who they are and their knowledges, it's not something that's currently extremely valued, which means that it's very difficult for Indigenous scholars to engage in that work. Things, I think, are changing, certainly, but I think that if we're looking at academia and some of the institutions that exist, oftentimes this is unintended. So, of course, we're dealing with the university campuses and business schools that what I like to call engaging cosmetic indigenization, which means that let's put some teepees on campuses. Let's have land acknowledgement, which is not a bad thing in itself. But that hasn't really attracted more Indigenous students. That hasn't allowed Indigenous scholars to translate Indigenous knowledges. So there's still this firm hold on what academia is that's very institutional or institutionalized. And right now, if we look at decolonization and indigenization, and if we look at the context of business schools, it will require a paradigm shift. And that's going to take a lot of time to do, and it's going to take work from us and others around the world trying to engage in this very work. But paradigm shifts take a long time because we need to not destroy, but we need to cut down these pillars. Decolonization is about unlearning. That doesn't happen overnight. And Dara, I want to finish with this. I often say, when we look at land acknowledgement, I've told several people at Gustafson School of Business that instead of constantly acknowledging that you're not on your own land, why don't you pay rent to those whose land it is? Now that is way too crazy. We can never do that. So we're just going to keep acknowledging it and then feel good about ourselves because we keep acknowledging it. Now, again, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but certainly I hope that it's a starting point to something that's much bigger, because I didn't get to Gustafson to indigenize Gustafson. I didn't go there to say, hey, you got to do this or that. It's part of their strategic plan. They want to do that and engage in this process. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold them accountable for doing so, to make sure that it's done properly and not just cosmetically or on the surface. So to circle back, a lot of institutional barriers to generating Indigenous knowledges, although there is this political will and social will to open up and say, yes, the space is everybody's space, but there's still a lot of work to break down those institutional barriers.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Thank you, Frank. And so for Nimbus, I'd like to ask you, I know that the research that you have been awarded some funding is connected to conversations. So in New Zealand, Nimbus has received some Marsden funding, which is very prestigious funding and highly, highly competitive. This project that she's won funding for is connected to facilitating conversations. I see it as intergenerational conversations, as your personal story is connected, that journey of reflection through your own experience and creating opportunities for your daughter. The Marsden is connected to that. And I'd like to hear what that research is about.
Kia ora, Dara. So, I guess as I mentioned before, in terms of my research interests, I tend to just bring different parts of me together and different parts of my experience together. I think this funding has really given me an opportunity. It's basically someone saying, here's some money, go and do whatever your heart desires, right? And so I actually spent a good part of last year on parental leave with my daughter, who's now 11 months. And coming back into work this year, like one of my intentions has really been to try and bring joy into the work that I'm doing and to try and be just really positive, because I think, as we've heard, there is so much sometimes to be negative about, but I'm just trying to be, I guess, a little bit more intentional about, driving that myself and making sure that I'm taking on projects that are, interesting me and filling me up, in every way. So this funding, the project that I propose to do is with Māori mums and daughters. So again, my interest is in careers, so in what people do. And I noticed my teenager, she just turned 14 last year, pardon me, just turned 14 last year. And so we're starting to have conversations, or we've been having conversations about her future and what she'll be doing. And when I say conversations, I mean, I'm talking at her and she's like nodding and, smiling and walking in the opposite direction. And I, I have been thinking, like, how do other women do this? Like, how are other people dealing with this? How are other Māori women dealing with this? What are the impacts of these conversations that we're having on our young women? What are they seeing in terms of, our experience? I mean, me being in the university as an academic, like I said, was never something I envisioned, never something that was a part of my life growing up. And I was really curious, about the impact. What was she singing and how is that going to impact her going forward? And then how does that work for other people, like me or other Māori women around the country originally? And so those kind of questions, I guess, drove the proposal. So this project is about looking at how Māori women make sense of their careers and how Māori girls make sense of that as well. So it's basically a project that involves like having conversations with Māori mums and their teenagers. It also has a photo voice component. So it's going to be like participatory photography that they will, they'll basically use photographs to kind of express, their experiences or their career goals, as well as their kind of relationships with each other. So I'm really excited about it. It's a project that started just this year. So I have actually started a little bit of data collection. And again, it's exciting and frightening. And, I'm trying to make sure that I'm doing a good job, I guess. But I'm really excited about that. So in terms of the intergenerational component, I mean, obviously with the mums and daughters, it's very much that. But something that I start thinking about when you say that intergenerational transmission of knowledge, like for me, I start to think about just everybody who's been doing this. And this, I mean, life, who's been doing this before me, and what have I learned from them, or what am I kind of learning from them? And then also what can I pass on? So I think those things are like are kind of constantly living in my mind, and I'm constantly navigating those. I mean, even the joy aspect, I remember going to see very, very early in my PhD, seeing Professor Linda Smith talk at University of Auckland Marae, and one of the things she talked about was doing her doctorate in back in the day and talking about how they would just get together and talk about what was cool about being Māori, like that was the kind of the driving force. It's about the joy and being Māori and the work and how to kind of express that. And again, so those kind of things stay with me when I think of that intergenerational transmission. Like these people like Jason, our resident kaumātua here, with all his wisdom and experience and the things that I learn from him every time I hear him talk. We don't all have Jason's stamina, so we can't be doing 30 research projects, and some of us have, some two babies under 5 at the moment. So I'm definitely not engaging in that way. But yeah, I think just the sharing of knowledge has huge for me. I think this is where honestly I get a lot of the joy out of my career, has been in that sharing of knowledge, whether that's intergenerational or just with other, academics, other people in these spaces, even non-academics. But you'll know, Dara, that we have kind of what started as a postgraduate relationship, a couple of postgraduate students trying to get together to make sense of this thing we call the academic career and postgraduate study, that then kind of evolved into this, relational friendship, sisterhood type group that's carried on for us in our careers. And it's been pivotal in terms of just making sense, like I mentioned before, of, how we navigate this these tricky spaces of Indigenous knowledge and academic knowledge, and how we use these, whether it's in conjunction or as one kind of displacing the other, and how we just navigate all of these challenging things. But also about having conversations about what is cool about just being Indigenous as well. I get that from that group and that support network. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. I guess I hope to have a lot more to say about this idea of intergenerational transmission of knowledge at the end of my project, particularly around career and life and Indigenous futures. So I look forward to that.
Nice. So thank you so much for all of you sharing. So I hope that, what you're getting from the stories that are shared on this particular panel is a diverse range of perspectives around a broader sense of collective well-being, that each of our panelists is talking about this in different ways. And our work is also about weaving through these experiences Indigenous ways of being, knowing, and doing. But ultimately, that each of us is speaking to this idea that I started with in my introduction, the idea of potential, or the idea of enabling this potentiality, because what follows for all of us is the next generation, that these, the next generation is going to be picking up where we leave off. And if we can create these new spaces and new opportunities and this create a space for potential to be realized, that's part of that hard work of intergenerational research, that those pathways are there and they're kind of carved new, and also carved, we're taking old stories and I like to think about that idea of creative destruction as being something that's very generative, that it's a generative process to be able to take something and constantly put it into new cycles so that we can imagine that new and new and new again. But actually it's based in these old knowledges. And so I also want to it's time for us to have an opportunity to get into 4 breakout rooms with each of our panelists. The topics of the breakout rooms are going to be focused around each of the researchers' sort of general topic areas that we've just discussed. So this idea of creative destruction is something I think holds a lot of potential for Indigenous futures, for what's ahead with regards to Indigenous business and Indigenous economies. Shelley's this idea of trauma-informed learning in the classroom. What is the potential for that for our communities moving forward? What's the transformative potential of intergenerational wisdom in conversations? This is, connected to Nimbus's research. And with Frank, what's the transformative potential of institutional memory? So we'd like to spend the next, let's say 15 minutes in breakouts. So we'll go into these breakout rooms. They're going to be randomly assigned with everybody going into each of the 4. And then we'll come back and have a quick debrief before we finish our session together. And each of our panelists is just there to basically not give more wisdom. They've given you lots of wisdom in the panels, but to sort of listen and hear what are the thoughts that are spinning around in your head at this time. So, okay, I want to be respectful of everybody's time and recognize that the official time for this panel is coming to a close. So I would like to just say thank you so much to our panelists joining us from near and far, and to all of our guests who are joining us for the session today. I heard really fascinating conversations within the breakout rooms. And I think that, it's such a privilege to be able to have all of these expert voices as well. We hope that the conversations that are started here are conversations that will reverberate. We can imagine that they'll have ripple effects well beyond this particular panel, and we can keep talking and keep this conversation open. So I would really like to say thank you to Shelley Price. Thank you, Francois Bastien, Nimbus Staniland, and Jason Mika very much for joining us today and leaving us with some incredible wisdom and having such a fruitful dialogue across the panel. I'm happy to hang out if anybody wants to keep having dialogue, but if you would like to end or leave at this stage, thank you so much for joining us. I also wanted to thank Christine and Gerardo. Dana Higgins was helping to organize this. And I really want to say thank you so much for all of their energy and efforts and time that you put into helping us to have this conversation today. Thank you so much.